This is the temple that was supposed to last 1,000 years. Brigham Young himself made that declaration, and it may still last that long. But church leaders announced in 2019 that it would be closed for 4 years to make seismic renovations and update the design of the plaza surrounding it. Perhaps they were none too soon, because on March 18, 2020, we experienced a fairly strong earthquake here in Utah that was centered about a dozen or so miles to the west in the area of the Great Salt Lake. It caused millions of dollars worth of damage throughout the valley. But fortunately, there were no fatalities. When this temple reopens, Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called, will flock to the rededication. But it will be an even more important event for non-members of the faith. Since it was dedicated in 1893, hundreds of millions of tourists have come to this place to see the wonder that is the Salt Lake Temple. But many millions of them have left disappointed because they were not allowed to enter this edifice that took 40 years to build. In the 19th century, the media alleged that women were taken prisoners up to the top floor of this building, and the only way they could escape was to jump out the windows into the Great Salt Lake. Despite the fact that it would have been the longest jump in history, there were many around the world that believed such tales. There was a mystery about this building because it was off limits to the unbaptized, and even for many church members who were not keen on following the rules or commandments. When the renovations are completed, everyone, members, non-members, old and young, of every race and gender, will be allowed to tour the building for a few weeks before the rededication occurs. It will be the first time in a century and a quarter that non-members will be permitted inside. While women were not kept in here as prisoners, they did have an important part in its construction, because although men were the core of the workforce, the women were heavily involved in the final decoration and furnishing of the interior. These women were mostly Yankees from New England and English immigrants from the UK, but there were Southerners and Scandinavians, as well as a smattering from other countries as well. They were virtually all members of a church auxiliary called the Relief Society. My mother, Colleen Staker, served for the better part of a decade on the general board of this principal women's organization about 30 years ago, much too late to participate in the construction of this building, but she claimed and was proud of her Irish ancestry. My great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Anderson Howard, also served on the Relief Society General Board, as it is called. She was born in Ireland and came to Utah in 1853 after converting to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in her homeland. Her assignment in the decoration of the Salt Lake Temple was to upholster a chair with hand embroidery to decorate it. Because of these women in my life, I think I have some insights into the Relief Society, even though I have never been a member. I am here in front of the Relief Society building. This structure is the closest building to the entrance of the Salt Lake Temple. It is also currently closed due to the coronavirus pandemic. The Relief Society is one of the world's oldest and largest women's organizations. They used to say the oldest and largest, but caution in the use of superlatives is advisable, I suppose. The Relief Society was originally established in Nauvoo, Illinois, a growing city on the banks of the Mississippi River, which was building a temple of its own. On the 17th of March, 1842, on the upper floor of the red brick store that belonged to Joseph Smith, he set up this women's organization, and his wife Emma became its first president. On the day that the Relief Society was founded, it was St. Patrick's Day in Ireland, just prior to the famous potato famine. Joseph Smith gave Emma a $5 gold coin to begin the relief work for the poor. That event is celebrated here in Salt Lake City with this statue. Others also donated on that first day. The Secretary Eliza R. Snow donated the name of Female Relief Society of Nauvoo, a name that would be changed as the organization was later resurrected in Utah. I'm here on Orange Day, known sometimes in Ireland as simply the 12th, something that occurs on the 12th of July each year, which happens to be the birthday of my Irish great-great-grandmother. She disliked the marching that takes place mostly in the north of Ireland on her birthday, and she was happy to leave that part of Irish culture behind her, but she never abandoned her Irish identity. I had a woodworking instructor, a descendant of Earl Fitzwilliam, who once had large landholdings in Ireland. I baked some soda bread and other Irish goodies to take to class on St. Patrick's Day. He enjoyed them, but confessed he doesn't celebrate the holiday because his ancestors were Orange, or Protestant. I told him mine were too, but I think of it as a day to celebrate being Irish. There was no Relief Society birthday celebration on St. Patrick's Day this year. In a normal year, there would be a large St. Patrick's Day parade in Salt Lake, but the Hibernian Society canceled this year's activities. However, the Relief Society building would be closed today anyway, because today is Sunday. During normal times, there are free tours during the week when it is open, and I would take you inside to see it, but these are not normal times. Inside this building, it is mostly just offices for the women leaders of the Relief Society and other women's organizations. They have a large reception room to meet guests, and at least during the time that my mother came here almost every day, they had some artwork on display and gifts that came from around the world, Japanese dolls, European porcelain, and the like. There are also some small exhibits. It usually gets overlooked by tourists who come to Utah to see the more famous temple and tabernacle. However, it's worth visiting on a trip to this city. Today, there are more than 7 million members of the Relief Society organization in more than 170 countries around the world. When they decided to build this building back in the 1940s, it was going to cost around $1 million. The church agreed to pay half of the cost if the women raised the other half. The Relief Society asked each of its members to donate $5. That would be about $50 today, and made assessments or assigned quotas in each congregation called branches or wards. The very first congregation in the world to meet its assessment was the Spanish-speaking branch here in Salt Lake City, which later became the Lucero Ward. Despite the fact that the local leaders thought their members would be too poor to meet their quota, they decided to involve the entire congregation in preparing and serving a Mexican meal for the community in order to raise funds. It was so successful that they easily met their goal. Women from many other parts of the country baked goods, sometimes buying back their own baked items. Other projects were undertaken, such as selling eggs, to raise the $500,000 from the women. The Relief Society building has some distinctive design features. The golden figures that look something like torches on the outside of the building are actually bundles of wheat. They are symbols of the bread of life and all that, but they are also symbols of a grain storage program that was begun in 1876 when Brigham Young asked Emmeline Wells, another prominent Relief Society leader, to head up a committee of women to gather and store wheat for future needs. My great-great-grandmother, the Irish woman Elizabeth Howard, was a member of that committee, and I've written about her participation in that project that ultimately gathered hundreds of thousands of bushels of wheat. A few remnants of the grain storage can still be found throughout Utah. Much of the saved wheat was sent to San Francisco, California, for distribution to victims after the destructive earthquake of 1906. Conditions on the streets of that city were pretty dire right after the tremors. Some of the grain also went to help disaster victims in China. There was also a wheat shortage during World War I, and the U.S. government purchased a lot of the remainder. President Woodrow Wilson made a trip here to Salt Lake, and he met with Emmeline Wells to thank her for her efforts. And Emmeline, as she was affectionately called, was a plural wife who participated in celestial marriage, more commonly referred to as polygamy. Years after she became a widow, she moved into the Hotel Utah, this large, ornate structure on the other end of the block that has now been renamed as the Joseph Smith Building. The woman who got Relief Society rolling here in Utah was also involved in the organization in Nauvoo. She had served as the secretary when Joseph Smith named his first wife, Emma, to be the president, and her name was Eliza Roxy Snow. Eliza had also been married as a plural wife to Joseph Smith, and she became the great organizer of women in the West. Born in Massachusetts, she grew up in Ohio, where she converted from her Baptist and Disciples of Christ upbringing to join with some others in her family in the area outside of Cleveland who had accepted Joseph Smith as a prophet. One of the many projects she headed was the establishment of a hospital, the Deseret Hospital, in Utah. This is a photograph of the hospital directors. In the center of the photo sits Eliza R. Snow, surrounded by the next three general presidents of the Relief Society. Number 2 is Zina Young, another wife of Brigham Young. Number 3 is Bathsheba Smith, a plural wife of George A. Smith, a cousin of Joseph Smith, who was also the namesake of the city of St. George in southern Utah. Number 4 is Emmeline Wells. And the woman with the circle about her head is my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Howard. Other projects spearheaded by the Relief Society were a silk project that involved raising mulberry trees and silkworms to produce the precious thread used for silk dresses and other garments in order to avoid some expensive importations. This is the monument to the project that sits on the grounds of the Yale Crest Chapel in Salt Lake. An initiative to build separate buildings for the Relief Society women was also pushed, such as this one in the 19th Ward. While my mother was a Relief Society General Board member, she would go with other board members and the General Presidency every year on the 17th of March to visit the graves of the prior presidents of the Relief Society, starting with Eliza R. Snow's. Emma Smith was buried in Nauvoo, Illinois, so travel logistics made it impossible for all of them to visit her grave as part of their annual pilgrimage. But the other former presidents were all buried in relatively close proximity. I am following in the footsteps of these Relief Society leaders for at least the first part of the annual tour so that you can see where they went. Our first stop is here in the southwest corner of Temple Square. This building is called the Assembly Hall, and this is where Eliza R. Snow's body was brought for funeral services after her death in December 1887. I've written about it, so I will skip the details for now. I will note that there were 10 church leaders who spoke at her funeral. All of them were men. It was also the site of the funeral for Zina D. Young, another of Brigham Young's wives, who served as the General President of Relief Society after Eliza R. Snow. Zina died in 1901. By the time of her death, 3 women were among the speakers who offered eulogies. A big change had occurred during the time period when women were granted the vote in Utah. Both funerals featured the singing of a hymn authored by Eliza R. Snow that was originally entitled Invocation, or the Eternal Father and Mother. Later, the title was changed to O My Father. This is where my Irish great-great-grandma's funeral was also held. We are going to follow the route of these funeral processions here along South Temple Street and then on to the graves. In the continuation video, you will go with me where the Relief Society General Presidency and Board traveled on St. Patrick's Day each year. They would visit the graves, sing a hymn, and someone would read a short biography of each woman president of the Relief Society.